Chiagweeb! In my previous videos, you'll have learned all about Jiminy Annie, a fascinating fiddler who moved from Italy to Ireland in the 1700s. He's not very well known these days, but he was one of the greatest violinists of his time, and his contemporaries considered him the equal of Handel and Carolan. And as it turns out, our most famous musical expert, except for the Cranberries, is the Irish harper-composer Carolan, who lived around the same time. For 5 years, 1733 to 1738, Jiminy Annie and Carolan were both on the island of Ireland. They overlapped at least twice during that time. In 1733 for about 4 months, and from 1737 until Carolan's death on March the 25th, 1738. We'll say around a year. Did these two musical icons meet in person? Let's try to figure it out. So first, let's consider the geography. During his time in Ireland, Jiminy Annie was based in Dublin. In the little biographical information I have on him, there's mention of his travel between London, Dublin and Paris, but no other great centres of civilization, for example Leitrim, are mentioned. So that doesn't mean he didn't go elsewhere, but if he did, it wasn't documented. Carolan, on the other hand, really got around. He worked in at least 18 of the 32 counties during his lifetime. We know that he worked in Dublin and also 5 of the counties nearby: Kildare, Longford, Louth, Meath and Westmeath. He definitely visited Dr. Delaney, a big supporter of his, who lived in Glasnevin, Dublin. The history of the city of Dublin in 1818 tells us that he visited Jonathan Swift, the famous author. The Dean admired Carolan's genius, had him frequently at the Deanery House in Dublin, and used to hear him play and sing the Plerauca. So, geographically, it's quite likely that they were in the same region, if not the same county, at the same point. It just so happens that Jiminy Annie arrived in Ireland the same year that Carolan's wife, Mary, passed away. And weirdly, this strengthens the probability that they met. According to Garojo Halvaron, after his wife's death in 1733, Carolan took to the road again. So he was on a typical tour schedule, rather than staying at home with the wife and kids. From 1733, Garojo Halvaron also believes that Carolan's wife's passing left him severely depressed. And Carolan, it seems, was always a bit too fond of the drink, but it got to such a serious level after his wife's death that his doctors warned him to stop. Donal O'Sullivan has not one, but 2 anecdotes about Jonathan Swift, that famous author who lived in Dublin, and Carolan, both of which feature Carolan's heavy drinking as a key element of the story. Therefore, I think it's quite likely that Carolan visited Swift in Dublin while at the rock bottom of his drink problem, which would have been after Mary died in 1733 and coincided with Jiminy Annie's arrival in Dublin. But could Jiminy Annie and Carolan have gotten into the same room? Well, as I mentioned before, Jiminy Annie and Carolan played music for the upper classes. Jiminy Annie was invited to Ireland by the Baron of Tullamore. In 1738, there was only around 55 families in Ireland with the title from the English crown, so it was a tiny network, and I'm sure they all knew each other. And at least 12 of the families that Carolan had worked for had a title from the English crown. So I think Carolan and Jiminy Annie were just 1 degree of separation from each other. 2 sources, Walker and O'Connor, imply that Jiminy Annie corresponded with Carolan, and I think that's true. As both Jiminy Annie and Carolan were masters in their respective domains, I'm sure they would have been interested in meeting each other, and it's extremely likely that they knew people in common. Therefore, the only barrier I see to their meeting is timing. So what does the literature say about it? In 1760, the writer and poet Oliver Goldsmith wrote, "At the house of an Irish nobleman, where there was a musician present, who was eminent in the profession, Carolan immediately challenged him to a trial of skill. His lordship persuaded the musician to accept the challenge, and he accordingly played over on his fiddle the 5th concerto of Vivaldi. Carolan, immediately taking his harp, played over the whole piece after him, without missing a note, though he had never heard it before, which produced some surprise. But their astonishment increased when he assured them he could make a concerto in the same taste himself, which he instantly composed, and that with such spirit and elegance that it may compare, for we have it still, with the finest compositions of Italy. Who was that mysterious famous fiddler? Well, one possible clue is that he played music by Vivaldi, a famous Italian composer. So we could take this reference at face value and extrapolate that the person playing the Italian music was also Italian. Unfortunately, this is probably not wise, because Italian music was all the rage at the time. So hearing Vivaldi at a house party then was probably as normal as hearing an Ed Sheeran song at a wedding now. So we will never know. But in summary, Cute Story by Goldsmith, 1760, says unnamed famous fiddler met Carolan. They had a play-off, fiddler played Vivaldi, Carolan instantly composed a concerto in the same style. My hero, Bunting, a heart collector, gives the same version of this tale, practically word for word, in his introduction to his 1840 volume, except that he references volume 50 of the 1787 periodical The Monthly Review and prefaces this excerpt with "at the house of an Irish nobleman where Gimignani was present." And yay, we found out who it was! The mysterious musician was Gimignani, right? No. When Donal O'Sullivan, the king of Carolan research, went looking at Bunting's reference, there was no mention of this story to be found there. Instead, there was a scathing review of a book called A Historical Memoir of the Irish Bards. The only explanation I can think of is that my hero, Edward Bunting, must have been having a bad day and just gotten his reference notes mixed up, just this one time. And I could go through the 91 years of the Monthly Review periodicals up to 1840 and manually look for the correct Bunting reference. But the fact that there actually was an entry to do with harp at volume 50 implies to me that Bunting inserted the wrong harp reference from his manuscripts, taking this note rather than this one. Not that he made a typo regarding the wrong page or volume, so I'm not sure that's the best use of my time. But if you're interested, the great news is that 95 years of the Monthly Review periodicals are all online and free here. So in summary, until someone proves me wrong, Bunting, in 1840, says the unnamed famous fiddler in Goldsmith's story is Gimignani, but his reference doesn't agree. So I think this isn't true. So that author who got that scathing review in the Monthly Review, volume 50, 1787, was antiquarian Joseph Cooper Walker. Walker was born 24 years after Carolan died. At a mere 24 years old, he published Historical Memoirs of the Irish Bards. He was working in Dublin and he got most of his data on Carolan from an anonymous source. After the book was published, Walker sent a copy to Charles O'Connor, a family friend of Carolan. O'Connor responded to him, "In casting my eye over Carolan's life, I find that your anonymous correspondent trusted too much to informers who were ill-informed themselves. For being himself a child when Carolan died, he could furnish you with nothing from his own knowledge." As such, we know that a significant amount of Walker's biography of Carolan is at third hand and ill-informed. However, Carolan scholars don't entirely dismiss Walker, and Walker writes, "In the beginning of the last century, the then Lord Mayo brought from Dublin a celebrated Italian performer to spend some time with him at his seat in the country. Carolan, who was at that time on a visit at his lordship's, found himself greatly neglected and complained of it one day in the presence of the foreigner. 'When you play in as masterly a manner as he does,' replies his lordship, 'you shall not be overlooked.' Carolan wagered with the musician that though he was almost a stranger to Italian music, yet he would follow him in any piece he played, and that he himself would afterwards play a voluntary in which the Italian should not follow him. The proposal was acceded to, and Carolan was victorious. Although there's a few differences here, the themes remain the same as in Goldsmith's account. In summary, Walker, 1786, says a famous Italian fiddler met Carolan. They had a playoff. The fiddler played Italian music. Carolan improvised in the same style. Carolan wins. But a year after this was first published, Walker reproduced it in a magazine called the Dublin Chronicle on the 5th of July 1787 with one significant addition. He then said that the visiting Italian performer was Geminiani. Charles O'Connor's opinion of Walker's work, allied with the lack of consistency in his two accounts, combined with the lack of explanation for his second account, makes me sure that this story is not entirely correct. For the record though, 21 years after Carolan had died, Geminiani did move to the big house Coote Hill in Roscommon to be a violin tutor to Charles Coote. So it's obvious that he was open to staying in the houses of the gentry in the west of Ireland. And for all his faults, Walker's story is plausible within what we know of Geminiani's career. And finally, we have the Reverend Thomas Campbell. Campbell was 29 years older than Walker. He was 5 years old when Carolan died. His uncle, Baptist Johnson, was a patron of Carolan, had a piece composed in his honour and named after him. Campbell visited various parts of Ireland and in 1777 wrote a philosophical survey of the south of Ireland, where he records his impressions of what he saw and heard. Chronologically, socially and geographically, Campbell was far closer to the subject of Carolan than Walker was. Campbell only wrote a few sentences about Carolan, as opposed to the essays of Goldsmith, Bunting or Walker, but they include: his ear was so exquisite and his memory so tenacious that he has been known to play off, at first hearing, some of the most difficult pieces of Italian music to the astonishment of Geminiani. The only way Geminiani could have heard Carolan play, and therefore have been astonished by him, was if he was in the same room. So did Carolan meet Geminiani? It's up to you to decide who you believe: Goldsmith, Bunting, Walker or Campbell. Let me know what you think in the comments. Personally, I think Carolan did meet Geminiani. And did they have that playoff? Well, that's a subject for another day. But there's one thing that I can cling to for certain. Carolan was hugely influenced by the Italian composers. So right now, I am going to relax after all that research by playing a piece of music which exemplifies Carolan's joyous fusion of Gaelic harp and classical Italian composition, Van Tanabas.